The engine had defeated 3 senior engineers over 11 days. It sat dead in the center of the workshop like a curse nobody wanted to inherit, and the biggest race of the year was 72 hours away. Then Mason arrived. He had not been assigned to it. He had no authority to touch it. He was only a general maintenance mechanic, a single father working the floor to keep his 6-year-old daughter fed and sheltered. But he sat down beside that engine in the middle of the night, listened to it the way other men listen to a person they love, and fixed it in 8 hours. The following morning, CEO Evelyn called him to her office and fired him for unauthorized interference with company property. She did not know that Mason had designed that engine himself. Press play because the man they dismissed as invisible was the one who built everything they were proud of. Mason's apartment was the kind of place that told a story without a single photograph on the wall. Small, clean, and arranged with a precision that had nothing to do with poverty and everything to do with a man who had learned to carry only what was necessary. The kitchen counter held exactly 2 mugs. The bookshelf held manuals, not novels, and in the corner, near the supply closet, pinned with a single thumbtack, was a piece of paper folded into quarters, a technical drawing of some kind, the lines too fine and deliberate to be anything casual. Mason never explained it to anyone who came over, and almost nobody came over. Luna was 6 years old, and already accustomed to mornings that moved on a schedule. She sat at the kitchen table with her stuffed bear, a small brown thing shaped like a gear wheel that she had named Cog, propped against her orange juice glass, as though it needed a front-row seat to breakfast. She wore the same pair of star-print socks every Monday, because she claimed Mondays required lucky socks, and Mason had never once argued with that logic. "Are you coming home early today?" she asked, not looking up from her toast. Mason set her lunchbox on the counter and thought about the answer with the same care he gave most things. "I'll try," he said. That was the answer he gave most often. Not a promise, not a dismissal, just an honest acknowledgement that the world between leaving and returning held more variables than any man could fully control. Luna accepted it the way she accepted most things her father said, with a slow nod, and the quiet trust of someone who had never been let down enough to doubt him. He tied her shoes before she left for the neighbor's care, pulling the laces taut with a particular tension, not too tight and not loose enough to come undone mid-stride. For a fraction of a second, his mind calculated the friction coefficient of the knot against the material of her laces. Then he stopped himself and looked away, the way a man looks away from a mirror he does not want to face too early in the day. Vortex Motorsport occupied 4 city blocks on the east side of the industrial district, a gleaming compound of glass and steel that the late Richard Vance had built from a single workshop and a refusal to accept that American racing could not compete with European engineering. The company was now worth $2 billion. It employed 412 people, operated in 6 countries, and had won more championship titles than its founder had ever allowed himself to predict out loud. Evelyn Vance had inherited it 18 months ago, 2 weeks after her father's death, when she was 28 years old and still learning what it meant to be in a room where everyone waited for her to speak first. Mason had joined 3 months prior. His application listed 9 years of general mechanical experience, 2 references that checked out, and nothing else. No university degree, no professional certifications beyond the standard safety requirements. He had listed his previous employer as a small independent garage in Ohio that no longer existed. The hiring manager had flagged it as thin. Cameron, the chief operating officer who sat on the hiring committee that quarter, had approved it without comment. Mason was assigned to the lower workshop, the basement level, where the ventilation was weakest and the floor vibrated when the fabrication presses ran above. It was the kind of post that experienced mechanics requested transfers away from within 3 months. Mason had not requested anything. He showed up, did the work assigned to him, and spent whatever quiet time remained walking the perimeter of the ground floor, looking at the cars the way a person looks at old family photographs. His colleagues had taken to calling him the quiet one, and then simply the quiet guy, and eventually just the guy on level 2 because he spoke rarely, and when he did, it was almost always about a mechanical problem and almost never about himself. But occasionally, when he placed his palm flat against the body of a vehicle and closed his eyes for a moment, the way a doctor places a hand on a chest to feel what instruments cannot fully translate, something moved through his expression that, nobody down on the lower level could quite name. It was not concentration. It was closer to recognition. The crisis announced itself on a Monday morning with the sound of Isaac, the lead engineer, a 45-year-old MIT graduate with 20 years of competition-level mechanical experience, sitting down very slowly in his chair and saying nothing for nearly a full minute. The GT7's fuel injection system had failed in a way that did not exist in any technical manual, at any version, from any manufacturer. The failure was in the tertiary pressure delivery sequence, a cascade malfunction that the diagnostic software identified as impossible given the current system configuration, which was its way of admitting that it had no idea what was wrong. Isaac had spent 3 days on it. A pair of external consultants flown in from the German manufacturer had examined it, spoken to each other in low voices, and flown home without delivering a solution. Cameron called an emergency meeting on Wednesday afternoon. His voice in those meetings was always the same, deliberate, controlled, and carrying a faint undertone of patience with people who were not keeping up. The options, as he laid them out, were 2: postpone the race entry or substitute the vehicle. Both would cost money. Both would cost reputation. The only question was how much of each the company was willing to absorb. Evelyn said neither. She said it simply, without raising her voice, the way her father used to end certain discussions. Cameron looked at her for a moment longer than necessary, then wrote something in his notebook. Mason heard the entire exchange through the ventilation grate in the ceiling of the lower workshop. He was sitting on an overturned crate, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold, looking upward at nothing in particular. When the voices above went quiet and the meeting ended, he stayed where he was for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, to no one, "Tertiary pressure valve, secondary seal ring. They've never read the original drawing." Luna asked him that evening, while he read to her from a picture book about machines, why gears needed each other. He paused longer than the question required. Then he said, "Because alone, a gear is just metal. When they mesh together, that's when they create motion." Luna considered this with great seriousness, adjusted her grip on cog, and was asleep within 4 minutes. Mason sat beside her for a while after her breathing slowed, then carried the book to the kitchen table, turned to a blank page at the back, and began to draw. Not slowly, not uncertainly, his hand moved across the paper with the speed and precision of someone transcribing something they already knew by heart. The lines were fine and technical, and absolutely exact. He worked until midnight without looking up. At 2 in the morning, he drove back to the facility. His Level 2 access card worked on the building entry he was registered for overnight maintenance rotation, and the card did not distinguish between basement-level access and upper workshop access. The GT7 bay had a yellow tape line across the entry and a sign that read, "Restricted Authorized Engineers Only." Mason stepped over the tape without breaking stride. He did not bring unusual tools. He opened his standard-issue kit on the floor beside the car and began from the outside in, removing panels in an order that was not documented anywhere in the current maintenance protocol, because the current maintenance protocol was 3 generations removed from the original design logic. He worked from memory, not the uncertain memory of someone trying to recall a procedure, but the memory of someone who wrote the procedure in the first place. The tertiary pressure valve housing came apart in his hands the way it was meant to. He found the secondary microseal ring, a component so small and so specific that it was not listed in any version of the parts manifest that currently existed in the company's inventory system because Mason had added it by hand to the physical assembly before the first test run and had never formally documented it, intending to do so later. Later had not come. He replaced the seal with a component from a cross-referenced part number he kept memorized, reassembled the housing in reverse sequence, and ran a manual pressure check using the analog gauge on the wall, a gauge that most of the current engineering staff did not know how to read because it predated the digital diagnostic system by 15 years. At 6:47 in the morning, the GT7's engine turned over and ran. The idle was smooth. The pressure readings were exact. Mason wiped his hands on a shop rag, packed his kit, and went to the lower workshop to start his regular shift. Dominic found him there at 7:15. The workshop chief was 58 years old, built like a man who had spent 4 decades lifting things that were too heavy and refusing to admit it, and he had a look on his face that Mason had not seen in a long time, the look of a man who has just confirmed something he suspected and is not certain whether to feel relieved or afraid. Dominic said nothing. He looked at the GT7 across the floor. Then he looked at Mason. Then he looked back at the car. Mason met his eyes. A small nod passed between them. Dominic walked away without a word. Isaac ran the full diagnostic suite at 7:30 and stood for a long time reading the results. Every pressure indicator was nominal. The fuel delivery variance was at 0.01% lower than the factory specification, lower than the car had ever recorded in actual testing. He called 2 members of his team over to confirm that he was reading the screen correctly. They confirmed it. Nobody knew what to say. Cameron was working late on the 5th floor when the repair happened. He saw it on the security feed, the timestamp, the access log, the unmistakable figure of the Level 2 maintenance mechanic moving through the restricted bay with the certainty of someone who had been there before, many times before. Cameron did not go to Evelyn that night. He waited until morning, collected the footage, organized the access records, and constructed the presentation with care. He left out the diagnostic results. He did not mention that the car now ran better than it ever had. He said, when he sat across from Evelyn in her office, "We have an internal security issue. An unauthorized employee accessed a restricted area and performed unsupervised intervention on our most critical asset without clearance of any kind." Evelyn watched the footage. The timestamp read 2:16 in the morning. The figure on the screen moved through the bay without hesitation, without confusion, without the tentative quality of someone doing something they had never done before. "Is the car functional?" she asked. "That isn't the point," Cameron said. "I'm asking anyway." Cameron straightened his folder. "The point is precedent. We are still under regulatory review from the Harmon incident. Any undocumented technical intervention, regardless of outcome, creates liability exposure that we cannot afford." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. 18 months ago, she would have deferred immediately. She was still learning when not to. But Cameron was not wrong about the liability, and she did not yet have enough information to know what she was missing. She signed the termination notice. Mason arrived at her office wearing his work clothes, a gray long-sleeve shirt with the company logo on the left chest, clean but carrying the faint smell of machine oil that never entirely left him. He stood in front of the desk without sitting. His eyes moved briefly across the room when he entered a habit so fast it was nearly invisible, and stopped for a fraction of a second on the large photograph mounted on the wall to the left, the first GT Series car, the vehicle that had won the championship in 2015, photographed in Victory Lane with confetti falling and the crew surrounding it. In the lower left corner of the original photograph, almost too small to see from where Mason stood, was a small technical mark, 2 initials and a date, rendered in the same precise hand that had filled the back page of Luna's picture book the night before. Evelyn placed the tablet on the desk with the footage visible. "Can you explain this?" "I fixed the engine," Mason said. "You didn't have authorization to do that. The car works now. That isn't what I asked you." Cameron was standing to Evelyn's left. His voice was smooth and measured when he spoke. "Do you understand what that vehicle is worth? Do you hold any engineering certification relevant to that system? What exactly qualified you to touch it?" Mason did not look at Cameron. He kept his eyes on Evelyn. "Do you want the car to run?" he said. "Or do you want the paperwork to be correct?" The question sat in the air between them. It was not rude. It was not defiant. It was simply the most direct translation of what he was asking her to choose. And it was the kind of question that had exactly one honest answer. And that honest answer would require her to explain why she was firing him anyway. Evelyn looked down at the desk. Cameron placed one hand lightly on the back of her chair, barely a touch, barely visible, and she looked back up. "I'm sorry, Mason. Your conduct violated our safety protocols and the scope of your position. We're terminating your employment, effective today." Mason was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he buttoned the top button of his shirt slowly, without hurry, and looked at her one last time. "Before you run the car this weekend," he said, his voice carrying nothing louder than a suggestion, "you should read the original design drawings for the GT7, not the current version, the original. If the company still has them." Then he walked out. Cameron watched the door close. His hand, which had been resting on the back of Evelyn's chair, pressed down briefly on the fabric before he released it. Below the window, through 15 floors of glass and steel, the GT7 sat in its bay with an engine that sang exactly the way it was built to sing. Evelyn stood and looked down at it for a long time after Mason left. She told herself she was thinking about liability protocol. She was actually thinking about the phrase he had used, the original, and the particular weight he had placed on it. The way someone places weight on a word that contains more history than the word itself can hold. He collected Luna from the neighbor's apartment at 3 in the afternoon. She was at the kitchen table with a drawing of what appeared to be a robot made entirely of circles, and she ran to the door when she heard him come in. "You're early," she said, surprised in the pleased way of someone whose expectations have just been exceeded. "I don't have work anymore," he said. Luna looked at him. "Are you sad?" He crouched down to her level, the way he always did when he had something real to say. "No, but we're going to find something new. Will the new place have cars?" He almost smiled. "Every place has cars." She nodded solemnly, satisfied, and went back to her robot drawing. Mason made dinner, watched her eat, read to her, and waited until she was asleep to pick up his phone. He dialed the number he had deleted 3 nights ago, the one he had memorized before he deleted it, because he memorized things without trying to. 4 rings. Then a voice older, familiar, carrying the weight of a man who had been waiting for this call, without ever being certain it would come. "I knew you'd call eventually," Dominic said. "The car told on you." The race weekend came and went. The GT7 ran every lap cleanly and finished second Vortex's best result in 9 years. The pit crew was loud. The engineers were jubilant. Photographs were taken, numbers were discussed, future projections were revised upward. Evelyn stood at the edge of the pit lane in the noise and the light and felt none of it properly. She had one hand in her jacket pocket, fingers resting against her phone, and she was thinking about a drawing she had not yet found. The car had told her something she had not been ready to hear the week before, and now the noise of the celebration felt like a language she understood, only partially, as though the event itself were speaking in a dialect she had been raised alongside but never formally taught. Monday morning, she went looking for Dominic. He was in the lower workshop eating lunch alone, sitting on the same overturned crate where Mason used to sit, looking out at the bay with the particular stillness of a man who has been watching the same view for a very long time and is no longer sure whether he is watching it or waiting for something to appear in it. "Did you know who he was?" Evelyn asked. No greeting. Dominic preferred directness. He chewed slowly. Set his sandwich down on its wrapper. "I knew from his 3rd day here. Maybe his 2nd. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because he didn't want me to. And because he had the right to decide that for himself." He looked at her then, the look of a man who has made his peace with a long silence and is now choosing, deliberately, to end it. "But I'll tell you something now, since you're asking, and since it's past the point where it can be taken back." Evelyn sat down on a nearby stool. 10 years ago, Dominic said, "your father hired a 21-year-old with no degree and no credentials, and a paper napkin full of sketches. He found him through a technical forum, some small community of self-taught mechanical engineers who posted problems and solutions for the pleasure of it. Your father said it was the most precise load distribution diagram he had ever seen from someone who was supposed to still be in school." He paused. The young man's name was Mason Cole. He quit college, came here, and in 3 years designed 7 engine variants. The GT7 was the last one. It was built for the 2017 season. Evelyn's hands were still in her lap. "What happened?" "His wife died. Road accident. The baby was not yet 1 year old." Dominic's voice did not soften around the fact he stated it the way a man states a structural truth, because sentiment would reduce it. "He disappeared, left everything on his desk and walked out. Nobody tried very hard to find him, because the company was in transition and your father was already sick and there was a great deal of confusion about a great many things." "And the drawings?" "The original drawings, the handwritten set, the ones with his mark on them, were on his desk when he left. By the time anyone organized the handover documentation, they were gone. He did not say Cameron's name. He did not have to. The direction of the implication was as clear as a bearing in alignment." Evelyn sat with that for a moment. The air in the lower workshop smelled of metal and oil and the particular staleness of a room where ventilation has never quite kept pace with the work being done in it. "He came back," she said. "Not a question. He came back because he was worried about the car. The GT7 has a modification in the tertiary pressure assembly, a secondary seal ring that he added by hand before the first test run and never formally documented. Without someone who knows it's there, the system runs fine for years. Then it doesn't." Dominic folded the wrapper around the remainder of his lunch, with the same care he applied to everything. He heard, somehow, that the car was struggling, so he came back as a maintenance worker. No name anyone would recognize, no claim, just to be near enough to fix it when it needed fixing. Evelyn was quiet for a long time. Then, "He wrote to my father." "I know." She looked at him sharply. "Your father told me. 3 months before he died, he said a letter had come from Mason and he was going to respond, but he kept putting it off because he didn't know how to say what needed to be said, and he was running out of strength to say difficult things." Dominic's expression did not change, but something in it acknowledged the grief that Evelyn did not show on her face. He didn't get to it. "I'm sorry." Evelyn left the lower workshop and went back to her office. She sat at her desk without removing her jacket. Then she stood up and went to the archive room on the 3rd floor, a space that most of the current staff did not know existed, lined with flat files and document boxes and the accumulated paper history of a company that had once been small enough to keep everything in a single room. She found the storage unit registered under her father's personal records. The combination lock was a 6-digit number, her mother's birthday, because her father used the same combination for everything and had never once worried about whether that was secure. Inside were contracts, correspondence, and near the bottom of the last drawer, a flat cardboard envelope sealed with tape that had yellowed at the edges. The return address read M. Cole, and the postmark was 3 months before her father's death. She opened it. Inside was a single folded page. The handwriting was clear and direct, without flourish. "I heard you aren't well. I don't expect you to respond to this. I don't expect anything. But if Evelyn ever needs someone who knows the GT system from the foundation up, I still remember every measurement. I'm not asking for recognition. I only want to know that the car is safe. The car deserves better than what's happening to it. And so does the driver. M.C." Evelyn sat down on the floor of the archive room with her back against the shelf and the letter in her hands. Her father had liked to say, when she was young and restless and impatient with detail, the difference between a good car and a great car is not in the metal. It's in whether the person who built it was listening when they built it. She had never fully understood what he meant by that. She was beginning to. She photographed the original GT7 drawing from the archive, the one her father had locked away separately, the handwritten set, with the fine technical notations in the lower margin and the 2-letter mark in the corner. And she pulled the current engineering files and put them side by side. The modification Dominic had described was there in the original and absent in every subsequent version. 3 teams of engineers over 10 years had worked from the simplified copy and had never known there was a deeper document underneath it. Cameron had known. He had known because he was the one who took the original drawing off Mason's desk and submitted it to the board with the attribution removed. He had known because he had watched the simplified version propagate through the company's systems for a decade and had never corrected it. And he had known the moment Mason walked into the facility 3 months ago with a false surname on a thin resume exactly who he was looking at. Cameron had not flagged Mason's hiring to protect the company. He had approved it to keep Mason close and visible and controllable. A maintenance worker with no title and no standing could be removed at any convenient moment, and he had engineered exactly that removal, using a liability argument that was technically valid and morally empty, before Mason's presence became something harder to manage. What Cameron had not calculated was that Evelyn Vance would go looking for something that no one had looked for in 10 years. She called him to her office the following afternoon. She did not schedule it through his assistant. She sent the message herself, directly to his phone, and when he arrived, she was standing at the window with her back to him and 3 items arranged on her desk. He looked at them. He did not sit down. The first was the original handwritten GT7 drawing set, with the notation in the lower margin and the initials in the corner. The second was a chain of internal emails from 10 years prior, authored by Cameron, submitted to the board, attributing the GT design to the engineering department in aggregate. The third was a paper napkin yellowed, creased, handled carefully, with a pressure distribution sketch in pencil and the same two-letter mark. Dominic had kept it in his wallet for 10 years in the uncelebrated and total way that certain men hold on to proof of things that should not be forgotten. The licensing deal with the German group, Evelyn said, still at the window. It's terminated. The GT design intellectual property cannot be licensed by Vortex because the original authorship was never formally assigned. The actual author never signed a transfer agreement because no one ever presented him with one, because no one ever acknowledged that the document existed. She turned around. You have 48 hours to work with legal counsel. Cameron's voice, when it came, was even. He abandoned the work. He walked out. This company developed and refined and manufactured. He walked out because his wife died, and he was 21 years old and alone with a newborn. Her voice did not rise. It settled, the way her father's voice used to settle when he had finished deciding something. And he came back here, without asking for anything, and fixed the car that was going to kill our driver if nobody caught the fault. I'm not having this conversation anymore. Cameron left. He did not say another word. The door closed behind him with the particular silence of a man who has calculated his remaining options and found them insufficient. There would be meetings with attorneys. There would be language negotiated and documentation reviewed, but the thing that could not be negotiated or reviewed was already settled not by a board or a contract or a termination letter, but by a paper napkin and a broken seal ring and a man who had come back simply to keep a car from killing someone on a racetrack. Evelyn stayed at the window for a long time. Below, through the glass, the GT7 sat in the workshop, polished and exact, carrying in its engine a repair that had been made in the middle of the night by the man who had built it from nothing a decade before. She drove to Mason's apartment the following morning. She rang the bell and the door was opened by a small person in gear-print pajamas, holding a stuffed bear by one ear. "My dad is fixing my car," Luna said, by way of greeting. Through the door, Evelyn could see Mason on the kitchen floor, cross-legged, with a toy car in pieces in front of him and a miniature screwdriver in his hand. He was working with complete concentration, the same quality of attention she had seen in the security footage, the same stillness on a vehicle that cost roughly $5. He looked up when he heard her voice. He was not surprised. He set the screwdriver down, told Luna to play in her room for a few minutes, and stood up. They stood in the small kitchen. She put the letter on the table, the one addressed to her father, the one that had never been answered. He looked at it for a long time without picking it up. Then he did, and held it the way a person holds something that has weight beyond its physical presence. "Why didn't you say anything?" she asked. "When I fired you, why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't come here to reclaim anything," he said. "I came because the car needed someone who understood its original design. That's all." "That's all," she repeated very quietly, and the words did not quite fit the thing she was feeling. "The GT7 has a failure mode that no one in your current engineering team can diagnose from the existing documentation," he said. "Not because they aren't capable, because the documentation is incomplete. That's not their fault. If the car runs enough seasons without someone catching the valve sequence, it fails at speed. Your driver this season is 24 years old." "Xavier," she said. "Xavier," he confirmed, as though the name were the only necessary argument, and it was. Evelyn sat down at his kitchen table, without being invited, and without apologizing for it. A moment passed. "Cameron took your drawings." "I know. Did you know when you came back?" He was quiet for a moment. "I suspected. I didn't come back to deal with Cameron. I came back to fix the seal." She looked at him across the table, this quiet, careful man who had sat in her building for 3 months without a title, who had fixed a $2 billion engineering problem with a component the size of a thumbnail, who had been dismissed with a form letter and had said, on his way out, only that she should read the original documents, and she thought about what it meant to be in a room where everyone was looking for credit and no one was looking at the car. "I'd like you to come back," she said. "Not as a maintenance worker." She slid a folder across the table. He opened it, read it from the first line to the last with the patience of someone who does not sign anything without understanding it. She watched him. He was thorough and unhurried, and she recognized it as the same quality she'd seen in her father when her father read contracts, the recognition that language, like engineering, does not forgive imprecision. The confidentiality of personal history clause, he said. You decide what's public. I won't put you in front of a camera or a board or a press release without your explicit agreement. She paused. But I can't remove your name from the drawings. It was always there. It should have always been there. He was quiet for a moment. He knew I'd come back, didn't he? Your father, Evelyn held his gaze. He knew things he didn't have time to explain to me. I'm still finding them. Mason picked up the pen from the folder's inner pocket and signed the contract on the signature line with the same signature that appeared in the lower corner of the original GT7 drawings. The same two initials, the same angle, the same quiet certainty of a person who has known who they are for a long time and has simply been waiting for a moment when it was safe to say so. He set the pen down. One condition, not in the contract. She waited. Xavier runs a full technical briefing before his next race. Not the maintenance protocol, the original design logic. He deserves to know what he's driving. Done, she said without hesitation. Luna emerged from her room at exactly the wrong moment and exactly the right moment, as she usually did, wearing one sock and holding Cog by both ears and asking whether the guest was staying for lunch. Evelyn said she couldn't. Thank you. Luna appraised her with the frank assessment of a 6-year-old and said, You have nice shoes, and went back to her room. Mason was almost smiling. Evelyn stood. At the door she paused, because there was one thing left that she needed to say, and it was the kind of thing that did not have a clean, professional form. I'm sorry, she said, for not asking the right questions when I should have. Mason considered this with the same seriousness he gave everything. You asked the right questions eventually, he said. That counts. He came home that evening at 5:30, the first time in weeks that he had been there before the light went out of the sky. Luna heard the key in the lock and came running from the kitchen with flour on her hands because the neighbor had been teaching her to make biscuits, and she grabbed his arm and pulled him in to see the biscuits, which were uneven and slightly too brown on one side, and which she described as perfect. He sat at the kitchen table and ate a biscuit and did not think about pressure valves or board presentations or what the next 6 months would require of him. He thought about whether they needed more orange juice and whether Luna's lucky socks had been washed, and whether the toy car on the kitchen floor still needed its rear axle alignment corrected, which it did. After dinner, after Luna's bath, after the reading and the good night and the particular stillness that settled over the apartment when she finally slept, Mason sat alone at the kitchen table with the folder from the day's meeting open beside him and a blank sheet of paper in front of him. He did not draw anything technical. He sat with the quiet, the way he had learned to sit with it, not fighting it, not filling it, just occupying it. In his jacket pocket was an envelope that Dominic had handed him at the coffee shop 2 days before, the one a dead man had written with the intention of giving it in person and had never gotten the chance. Mason had read it twice, and then folded it along its original creases and placed it carefully in his inside pocket next to nothing else. The card tucked inside it old company stock, bearing the title Chief Design Engineer. Above his name he had not thrown away and had not displayed. He had placed it at the back of the kitchen drawer, under the flashlight batteries and the spare key, where things were kept not because they were decorative, but because they were real. He thought about what his daughter had said, months ago now, sitting at this same table with a picture book open between them. Because alone, a gear is just metal. When they mesh together, that's when they create motion. He had given her that answer. He had not been certain, at the time, that he believed it for himself. He was beginning to. The following morning, he arrived at Vortex at 7:45, not through the lower workshop entrance. Through the main door, where the receptionist said good morning and used his name correctly, and the badge clipped to his chest read something that had been true for 10 years and was only now printed down. Dominic was at the workshop entrance with 2 cups of coffee, holding one out without a word. Mason took it. Isaac crossed the floor within 2 minutes, already talking. I read the original drawings last night. All of them, cover to cover. I have 17 questions. Mason looked at him at the genuine urgency of a skilled engineer who has just discovered that the foundation of his understanding of a system is deeper and stranger and more elegant than he knew, and felt something settle in, his chest that had been unsettled for a very long time. "I have all day," he said. On the 15th floor, Evelyn stood at the window of her office and watched them below Mason and Isaac, seated side by side near the GT7, a fresh set of drawings spread between them, both men leaning in over the paper with the posture of people building something. She had her phone in her hand. A message had arrived that morning from a representative of one of the largest racing organizations on the continent. They had observed the GT7's performance data from the previous weekend. They were interested in a conversation about technical partnership. They would like to meet with her design team at her earliest convenience. She typed her reply, "We'd be glad to meet. Our design team is in the process of re-establishing. Give us a little time to get properly oriented." She sent it, put the phone face down on the desk, and turned back to the window. Below, the workshop was alive, with its ordinary noise, the press of metal, the high tone of an alignment instrument, the low hum of something being tested and corrected and tested again. And beneath all of it, if you were standing in exactly the right place, and you were the kind of person who listened not for what was loud, but for what was true, the sound of the GT7's engine, running exactly as it had always been designed to run, as it had always been capable of running steady, certain, and finally, after 10 years of silence in the hands of someone who knew every note of it by heart,